right, good afternoon, and welcome. We're so happy to have you here. I'm Angelique Campbell, a senior officer in the Division of Consumer and Community Affairs here at the Federal Reserve Board. I am extending, on behalf of the Federal Reserve, I'm extending our heartfelt appreciation to all of you for joining us at this year's Rural Investment Convening. Your time is valuable, so we hope to make great use of it over the next 2 days. As experts and practitioners who are working to turn challenging economic conditions for rural communities into community-led strategies for revitalization and growth, you are best positioned to share with us what is working and what is possible in rural communities. We look forward to listening to you and learning from you, and hope you will learn and do the same with each other and lean in. So I also want to offer my thanks to the Federal Reserve leaders who are with us today. Board Governor Michael Barr, who will open with remarks and moderate a fireside chat with President Susan Collins, President of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, Anna Paulson, the President of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, and Tom Barkin, President of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. So it is now my pleasure to introduce you to Governor Michael Barr. Governor Barr took office as a member of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System on July 19th, 2022 for an unexpired term ending January 31st, 2032. He currently serves as the board's oversight governor for the Division of Consumer and Community Affairs, where he plays a central role in advancing policies that safeguard and strengthen the financial well-being of consumers and communities across the nation. His strong dedication to this mission is both clear and consistent and reflected in his active engagement with my division's work. Thank you. Governor Barr has also served as the Vice Chair of Supervision for the Board of Governors as well. Prior to his appointment to the board, Governor Barr held numerous positions at the University of Michigan, including Dean of the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy, and the founder and faculty director of the university's Center on Finance, Law, and Policy. While there, he co-founded the International Transactions Clinic and the Detroit Neighborhood Entrepreneurs Project. And Governor Barr has also fulfilled many special advisor positions and leadership roles at the U.S. Department of the Treasury, including Assistant Secretary for Financial Institutions, where he was instrumental in advising on the public-private partnership approach that was designed to benefit underinvested communities that we all know now as the New Markets Tax Credit. So as you will see in his bio, Governor Barr's list of accomplishments is extensive as it is impressive. And I hear he is still celebrating the win of the University of Michigan men's basketball NCAA championship. I'll let him go on that. Thank you, Governor Barr. Please join me in welcoming.
See if I can do this without too much damage to your screen. Angelique, thank you so much for that warm introduction. It is great to be here with all of you to celebrate the incredible opportunities in rural America and to talk about strategies that are effective to do so. During my career, I've had the opportunity to work on issues affecting rural communities, especially access to capital. My time at the Federal Reserve has only deepened my appreciation for the opportunities and challenges of rural America as I've traveled over the past several years to rural communities. These communities share many challenges, and they also face distinct obstacles that require flexible solutions. What has stood out to me is the level of innovation and creativity behind many of those solutions. We can and should do more to elevate these examples, sharing what works and spreading ideas that can expand opportunity and support economic growth in rural America. Back in 2023, I had the opportunity to travel the Blues Trail in the Mississippi Delta from Jackson to Memphis. Along the way, I met with local leaders and financial institutions, some of whom are represented here today, to learn how once thriving rural railroad towns are adapting to both longstanding and emerging challenges. In Moorhead, Mississippi, where it's known as where the Southern crosses the Yellow Dog, I saw how a bank that had struggled to maintain a branch to donate its building to a CDFI preserving access to banking services for a community that needed it. In Clarksdale, Mississippi, I visited the Travelers Hotel, which was redeveloped using New Markets tax credits and is now contributing to the resurgence of that community, focused on blues tourism. I've also connected with the Delta Philanthropy Forum, a collaborative network of philanthropic partners investing in the region to deepen impact in sustainable ways. We discussed how philanthropy can serve as a critical bridge, providing capital for essential infrastructure like broadband and water systems, while also amplifying the voices of community members who are too often left out of local decision-making. On another trip, I met with leaders of banks serving members of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes on the Flathead Indian Reservation in western Montana. They spoke candidly about the challenges of providing affordable, accessible credit, particularly for home mortgages on trust lands. And I spoke with tribal leaders on the Blackfeet Reservation about the health and education challenges their communities were facing. Another visit when I met with farmers, ranchers, and community leaders in Nebraska, I heard about how shifts in labor availability, production costs, and technology are creating uncertainty for them, as well as for anchor institutions like hospitals and schools. And at the same time, I heard powerful examples of resilience and opportunity, from young entrepreneurs planting the seeds of innovation to farmers reaching new markets with their crops. My travels have shown me the great diversity across rural communities and reinforced the importance of adapting approaches rather than relying on a single narrative or a uniform community development policy. As this audience knows well, rural America is not one story, but many. Its economic foundations, geographical characteristics, and future trajectories differ not only from region to region, but often from one community to the next. Rural communities are highly diverse in ways that shape both their challenges and opportunities. Their economic outlooks are closely tied to local industries, which vary widely from oil and gas or manufacturing to agriculture. At the same time, the physical and spatial nature of rural areas differ across regions, with some places featuring closely connected, denser towns, and others defined by vast distances and limited access to urban centers, influencing everything from services to labor markets. The outlook for rural communities is far from uniform. While some struggle with workforce shortages, affordability issues, and institutional decline, others are adapting and thriving by diversifying their local economies, strengthening local leadership and institutions, and leveraging natural or cultural assets to attract residents and visitors alike. While each rural community is unique, these areas share a common reality. Vitality requires sustained effort, coordination, and intention. This is true whether the challenges stem from intrinsic issues, such as population trends, externally generated events, such as trade policy and geopolitical events, or longer-term trends, including such things as artificial intelligence. And I'll discuss each of these areas in turn. Research shows many communities face overlapping intrinsic structural challenges that complicate economic revitalization. A key constraint is population decline and aging. USDA data show that in 2023, rural counties had relatively low shares of prime age working adults, those aged 25 to 54, while residents 65 and over grew from 7.4 million in 2010 to 9.7 million in 2023. This imbalance leaves a smaller labor force supporting both younger and older populations. At the same time, migration, especially from foreign-born individuals, has become critical. Between 2020 and 2025, 47% of rural counties grew, but only 25% did so through increases in their local population, while over 86% relied on net migration. Rural areas also face the loss of key institutions like banks, hospitals, and sometimes even regional colleges, weakening access to capital, services, and economic stability. Often, communities that rely on a large employer or a single industry suffer or struggle when those employers and industries leave. Long-term employment declines in agriculture and manufacturing, driven by automation and globalization, have further reduced traditional job growth without consistently replacing them. Even though regional universities and community colleges can buffer these losses, many communities risk losing this support because of college closures and financial strains. Affordable housing shortages are also a major constraint. Studies show that over 1/3 of rural renters are cost-burdened, but homeownership can also be more affordable and attainable in some rural areas, with costs averaging 26% of median income versus 33% in metropolitan areas on average. Despite these challenges, there are numerous examples of resilience where rural communities have managed to overcome internal constraints. Before I turn to some externally generated challenges, let me just highlight a few success stories that I've heard about. And two of these success stories come from a recent Brookings Institution study on success in rural America. Like many small Mississippi Delta towns, DeWitt, Arkansas depended heavily on agriculture and a single major employer. When a shoe manufacturing plant closed, the town lost a significant share of its jobs, exposing the risks of economic concentration. Young people began to leave, investment slowed, and a broader set of decline set in. An early attempt to reverse this, a biofuel project built around a new crop and local processing, ultimately failed because of a poor fit with local conditions and external market challenges. However, that failure proved pivotal. It brought community members together, introduced new ways of thinking about economic development, and shifted the local mindset from resignation to experimentation. What followed was a fundamentally different approach to growth. Instead of attracting one large employer, DeWitt focused on building many small locally owned businesses, creating a more resilient and diversified economy. Leaders leaned into the town's natural assets, particularly its proximity to major hunting and fishing areas. This spurred growth in tourism, outdoor retail, and hospitality. Entrepreneurs began launching and adapting businesses based on real demand, supported by modest placemaking efforts and outside organizations that provided guidance without taking control. In the end, DeWitt's revitalization was not driven by a single project, but by a combination of mindset change, local ownership, economic diversification, and a willingness to adapt, turning a failed initiative into the foundation for long-term renewal. Similarly, Thomas and nearby Davis, West Virginia, are two former coal and timber towns that reinvented themselves as hubs for arts, culture, and outdoor recreation after a period of economic decline. As traditional extractive industries faded, new residents, artists, entrepreneurs, and small business owners helped rebuild the local economy around tourism, creative industries, and the natural landscape. A central player in that process, is often the case, was a community development financial institution, which acted as both a financial engine and connector across sectors. It provided small business loans, grants to entrepreneurs and artists, technical assistance, and support for local government capacity. Just as importantly, it aggregated and deployed funding from multiple federal sources, such as the U.S. Treasury CDFI Fund, USDA lending programs, AmeriCorps, and the Appalachian Regional Commission. This is where public-private partnerships became critical. Federal dollars flowed through a locally embedded institution, which then partnered with municipalities, nonprofits, and private entrepreneurs to finance businesses, revitalize buildings, and address constraints like housing. The result was a network development model that enabled sustained growth, but trying to preserve community character. There are also impressive partnerships addressing the mortgage challenge I mentioned earlier in Indian country. Several CDFIs are helping deliver home mortgages on trust lands through a collaboration with USDA Rural Development. By combining culturally appropriate credit practices with character-based underwriting, in one region, local CDFIs were able to make 35 loans. That sounds small, but it represents a 400% increase in these types of loans in the communities that were affected. These examples highlight how rural communities deal with some of the intrinsic constraints discussed above, such as losing a major employer. But recent external events are also weighing heavily on rural areas. Rapidly changing trade policy and geopolitical events have affected rural communities dependent on foreign markets and foreign suppliers. International partners purchased roughly $175 billion in agricultural products in the United States in 2024, about 20% of all U.S. production. For certain commodities, reliance on international markets is particularly concentrated, such as soybeans, where more than 40% of U.S. production is ultimately exported. These relationships have been significantly disrupted by tariff policy. For example, according to the USDA, U.S. soybean exports to China during the first 3 quarters of 2025 were 38% lower than the same period in 2024. Higher U.S. tariffs, especially on steel and aluminum, impose further costs on farmers as they raise the price of agricultural machinery. Most recently, supplies and prices for fertilizer have been affected by conflict in the Middle East. More than a third of global exports of urea pass through the Strait of Hormuz, and the interruption has led to a sharp price increase in this important fertilizer, up about 55% since the beginning of this year. Prices for diesel, another important input for agricultural products, rose 50% over the past year. Rising fuel prices place significant pressure on cattle farmers and rural communities by increasing both direct and indirect production costs. Higher diesel prices raise expenses for operating equipment and transporting livestock, while also driving up the costs of key inputs, like fertilizer and feed. Transportation costs across the beef supply chain also rise with fuel prices, contributing to higher consumer prices and squeezing returns for producers. Similarly, higher diesel prices are burdensome for dairy farmers because fuel is used at every stage of milk production and transport. Given rapidly changing circumstances, it is much too early to know the path for prices as events in the Middle East unfold. There are also several evolving economic trends that are likely to have enduring consequences for rural communities in the United States. Among them, the rise of data centers, the shift toward high-skill service sectors, and the growing use of artificial intelligence. AI may improve agricultural productivity. For example, research from the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City suggests that in some regions, more than half of agricultural employment could experience substantial productivity gain through the adoption of AI-enabled technologies. Other research finds that the rapid expansion of AI-driven data centers is increasingly concentrated in rural areas, bringing potential benefits such as tax revenue and infrastructure investment, but also significant trade-offs, including high energy and water demands, strain on local infrastructure, and uncertainty about the quantity and quality of long-term jobs created. At the same time, broader structural changes in the U.S. economy, particularly the long-term shift away from goods-producing industries towards knowledge-intensive service sectors, have disproportionately affected rural regions, which often lack the capital, connectivity, and workforce needed to fully participate in these higher-skill industries, contributing to wider rural-urban economic gaps. At the Federal Reserve, supporting a healthy economy that works for all Americans is core to our mission. Monetary policy plays an important role in that effort. By promoting maximum employment and stable prices, monetary policy helps to create the conditions for businesses to invest, households to plan, and local economies, those in rural and urban communities, to grow and adapt. While monetary policy affects the whole country, understanding how these policies transmit through rural labor markets, rural small businesses, and rural agricultural economies contribute to broad-based inclusive growth. This responsibility is reflected in how the Federal Reserve System was designed. From the beginning, it has maintained a presence throughout the country, ensuring that the diverse experience and perspectives of people across America inform the decisions we make. At each Federal Reserve Bank, as well as the Board of Governors, dedicated community development teams work to ensure that those voices are heard and meaningfully integrated into our understanding of the economy. We actively seek to engage with as many communities as possible. And one of the important ways we do that is through our longstanding relationship with organizations working on the ground to build strong and stable communities. We listen closely through local sessions, through regional convenings like the Investing in Rural America series hosted by the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, and through national gatherings such as the recent National Community Investment Conference held in Phoenix. At that conference, we brought together a wide range of experts and practitioners to explore innovative solutions and emerging opportunities, particularly in public-private partnerships that can expand community investment. We highlighted issues to rural economic growth, including supporting tribal and rural small business investment, and catalyzing community development capital to support small towns and rural revitalization. In addition to these engagements, the Federal Reserve works to develop a deep, data-driven understanding of local economic conditions across the country. The Federal Reserve System conducts original research through tools such as the Survey of Household and Economics and Decision-Making, the Survey of Community Perspectives, and the Small Business Credit Survey. Just as importantly, we complement this quantitative work with qualitative research to better understand the why behind the data. We also recognize that a community's ability to attract and retain capital is essential to its vitality and its resilience. Within our broader framework, our implementation of the Community Reinvestment Act plays an important role in encouraging financial institutions to meet the needs of the communities they serve. Activities aimed at revitalizing or stabilizing distressed or underserved rural communities are a key part of CRA. Despite this progress, the needs of rural communities often exceed the resources available. And yet, what we consistently see, both in research and in communities across the country, is that when multiple sources of capital come together, when public, private, and philanthropic partners align, communities can truly thrive. That is why your work is so important. Thank you very much. And now I have the pleasure of inviting my distinguished president colleagues to join me. We're going to have a discussion, roundtable discussion, and please welcome them all now. So, thank you all for being here. One of the cool things about the job I have now is that I get to spend a lot of time with our Reserve Bank presidents, and they bring an incredible range of expertise to the table in their communities. And as I think you're going to hear, each of their communities is pretty different, even within their Reserve Bank. So let me just start. I'll start with Tom, and we'll go this way. Can you just describe for us, what are some of the rural communities like in your district?
So 5th District is West Virginia, Maryland, D.C., North and South Carolina, and Virginia. There's rural communities everywhere, but I sort of think of them as two big archetypes. We have a large part of Appalachia, and so you know what that looks and feels like and what the issues are. But we also have the I-95 corridor, and the I-95 corridor, unlike Appalachia, is majority minority. Unlike Appalachia, it's blue, not red. But those communities have the same sets of workforce, healthcare, education issues that you have in both places. So we really enjoy the chance to be present in both types of communities.
Cool.
Anna?
All right, so I'm representing Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Feds. So we're talking about the eastern 2/3 of Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New Jersey. So let me start with New Jersey, which you don't traditionally think of as a rural state. And indeed, by Census Bureau definitions, there are no rural counties in New Jersey. But in my travels to southern New Jersey, there are places that are distinctly rural in how they work. They meet some of the same characteristics as those that that Michael and Tom have both been talking about. New Jersey is not called the Garden State for nothing. It's the second largest producer of blueberries in the country, the third largest of cranberries, and I can go on and on. But so there are rural communities everywhere. Although of course it's a little different if you're in a rural community that's 90 minutes from New York City than if you're someplace in the far western corners of Pennsylvania. Delaware, another place where the southern part of the state is pretty rural. It has some advantages of having the opportunities to develop tourism as one of its local industries, but it's also a place where the entire state, chickens outnumber people 200 to 1. So the chicken industry is vitally important to that community and has been affected by some of the factors that you were talking about. You know, a lot of the chickens are exported, and a lot of the equipment that you use to raise chickens is imported, for example. And then Pennsylvania, you know, the rural communities are maybe more like what you picture as a rural community. Indeed, when there was the picture up here of the kind of, you know, small town Main Street, that looks like some of the places in the district that I've visited over, you know, since I started in July. And there you see a lot of the, you see really committed residents. Indeed, every rural place that I've visited in the district I've met somebody who grew up there, left, went to school, did some other things, and then came back because they wanted to raise their family in a community like the one that they grew up in, and they wanted to, you know, make that community what they needed for their family. And I think that part is something that's really, it's a little bit of an intangible, but it's really important. So places where people are, you know, I think in Pennsylvania, a distinctive feature of rural communities is that manufacturing is really important. So, you know, so of rural jobs, something like 23% of those jobs in Pennsylvania are in manufacturing. And so, you know, you think of agriculture, but a lot of rural jobs are manufacturing, healthcare, retail, and that's particularly true in Pennsylvania. So I'll stop there. There's a little flavor of all the range of rural communities.
That's great. Susan, do you want to describe your communities?
Sure. And first, just really delighted to be here with all of you. There's so many really important topics to discuss, and there's just a lot of expertise throughout this room, so a real pleasure. So the first district, which is the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston's district, is most of New England. And you know, all of New England except Fairfield County and Connecticut, basically. So 5 different states. And there's a theme here, which is that while there's some things that apply more broadly, there are also some real differences. And let me say a little bit more about that. But I also thought that, you know, it might be, as I thought about which of the many things to say, there are a number of misconceptions about rural communities that you know, I thought it would be helpful to mention. You know, one is the idea of agriculture being the economic driver, which is really, while there's certainly some communities, but certainly in aggregate, that is not the general story. In fact, the industrial mix and the share of employment is actually similar in rural areas nationally to urban areas, and that's also true in New England. And so, you know, in New England, for example, over 20% of people are employed in education and healthcare services, and over 15% in professional and business services. And so the diversity of the kinds of things people are doing is really important. And I think a theme there is that sometimes or often the aggregates actually mask big differences between what's happening in individual communities. And you heard about that from Anna and from Tom as well. So about 12% of the overall population in New England lives in rural communities. Unlike the national context where that's been declining, it's been overall relatively stable for the past 50 years in New England. And in Massachusetts, it's, you know, more like 2%. But then in Vermont, it's more like 60% of the population. So those are huge differences in terms of the different communities. And just to end with just a couple of examples. So while natural resources is overall a relatively small share of employment, there are coastal communities in Maine where it might, even the direct employment is over 20% in fisheries in those areas. And if you do the indirects, it's even larger than that. And then if you go to White River Junction, which is you know, close proximity to Dartmouth, you have a lot of engineering services, which is what's driving communities, the rural communities in that county, in that area. So the diversity I would highlight as well, absolutely challenges, but also a lot of dynamism and a lot of innovation and a lot of kind of connectivity and culture. So lots to discuss.
Yeah, that's great, Susan. And one of the things I really love about the panel we have here today, these 3 presidents, is they may not be the first 3 presidents that everybody thinks of as having communities that are in rural America, but they, for sure, you've just heard, are. there are rural communities all over the United States, and I think, the kind of attention that these three presidents are paying to issues in rural America is really just fantastic. I'm going to go the other way down the line, Susan, and ask you to maybe bring to the fore some of the, challenges and opportunities that you see in your community. I know that, as each of you have discussed, and I mentioned, there's broad diversity in kinds of communities in rural America, but maybe you could give us some examples of challenges and opportunities in your district.
Sure, and let me start with challenges, but I also want to highlight some of the opportunities and real inspiring examples of that. Some of the challenges that I hear a lot about are the same ubiquitous challenges that I hear from all of the communities across my district. Housing really tops the list, and I think a lot of people may not really recognize that in a lot of rural communities, some of the housing challenges, affordability, availability, might be even more acute. So, during the pandemic, there were a lot of people who recognized the beauty of rural areas in New England, and it actually exacerbated some of the housing challenges in terms of available housing stock. And so housing is really one of the key ones. There are other kinds of barriers to participation as well. Childcare challenges are quite significant in a number of different places. And also, some of the challenges related to youth migration, and that's a theme that I hear about, and aging. In terms, and then there are a lot of physical challenges as well. It's not just broadband, also cell service, healthcare access, infrastructure, so a variety of different types of things like that. I would say, and I mentioned dynamism and innovation, that connectivity and problem-solving dynamic, which is just palpable in so many communities, is really key. And just to mention maybe two examples. So Washington County in Maine, up in northern Maine, it's actually called the Sunrise County because it's the easternmost part of the U.S., and in that county, members of the county, together with leaders in the Passamaquoddy tribe, came together to really try to address challenges for living wage careers for young people, both because people were migrating back, but also to help people stay and to create vibrancy. And then a very different example in New England as well, in Maine as well, that challenges related to healthcare, the Jackson Labs creating a cancer genomic initiative, which essentially connects global experts in cancer virtually to healthcare community networks in rural areas across the state that would not otherwise have access to the kind of expertise to address those kinds of health challenges. And they're exploring ways to expand that. So a lot of innovation as well. And that really speaks to people together, coming together, and to the collaborations that it really can take to address some of those challenges effectively.
That's great. Quite a diverse range of challenges and opportunities.
So you're probably going to hear some similar themes here, but our team has been doing some focus groups with young people across the district, including in rural areas. And folks in the focus groups that we did in rural areas, younger people, are more likely to leave, where they're living now than compared to this, same people in urban areas, right? And a lot of that is looking at, well, where are the opportunities for me to, get a job, grow a career, things like that. The other thing that comes up in those conversations is access to transportation. It can be pretty challenging to live in a rural area, particularly if you don't have access to a car, or if you got to pay high prices for gas, all of those things. And so those are two things that are big challenges that are just of the people who are there. And then, of course, we all know about the demographic challenges, right? These tend to be places where the population is older, and that, I think, intersects with some of these challenges. So when I was in Hoonsdale, which is the northern part of Pennsylvania, this is a community where some people came during the pandemic and set up shop, and so there's been some renovation of properties. There's also an older community that really wants to age in place, right? So they have homes, but those homes, some of them, if you went and set out the inspector, somebody might say, I'm not going to give you a certificate of occupancy, right? Does the heat work? Does the roof need fixing, right? So this isn't so much, how do I build new housing stock, but how do I care for and repair the housing stock that we have so that individuals in those communities can live, in the ways that they want. And those are pretty, challenging, right? Like that's kind of, house by house, how do you solve that problem? And then I'll come back to this sort of like resilience and then the opportunity to look at things holistically. In one community, and I've only been on the job since July, so, so some of these are all blurring together here. But there's a community where there was a hospital shutdown, right? Like that's just awful for a rural community, right? These are jobs, this is access to healthcare, this is, so many things that pull a community together. And so folks got together to try to address this problem. And one of the innovative things that came out of those conversations was looking at it not just as like, how do we get a hospital here, but how do we think about this as both a healthcare access and a workforce development challenge so that you can tap into more funds, you get more people at the table, you think about how that hospital plays a role not just in your health ecosystem, but in your broader economic ecosystem. And that allowed them to bring back, a healthcare facility. And so that opportunity to connect and to think holistically about issues was really important for solutions. And I think that's an opportunity in a lot of different places.
That's great. Tom.
So we have a dual mandate, stable prices, maximum employment. When I started on the job, I talked to my team. I said, okay, where in our district are we winning and losing on maximum employment? And they defined it as employment to population, prime age. So what % of prime age people are in the workforce? And it turns out that the small towns in our district are 10 points lower than the district as a whole. And they're lower than the cities, and that includes the inner cities, which you sort of normally would have thought would have been the most challenged area. And that's what got me and us started on this journey of really focusing on and digging into the rural markets, because the challenge is getting people to work. And of course, and Susan and Anna have talked about all the issues, there's a set of preparedness issues, if I could put it that way, education, health outcomes, access to institutions like hospitals and banks that not only provide, stable platforms, but also role models of what it's like to be in the workforce and to survive. And then, of course, there's access to work, whether that be transportation or child care or housing and all those sorts of things. So those are the challenges, and I think we've all talked about them. I'll say on the opportunity side, we did a piece of research last year. The story out there is that small towns are shrinking. Kids are leaving, populations are shrinking. That's been true for the last 30 years, but that's not true for the last 5. And if you look at the last 5 years, not every small town is growing, but a third of them in my district are. And that's a real number. A third of the folks who were shrinking in the 10 years before the pandemic are growing now. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Obviously, remote work is relevant to it. Exurban growth is part of it, especially Susan mentioned housing. If you can't afford a house close, you might go move to a place where you only have to go to the office twice a week or whatever, and you might make the hour-and-a-quarter commute. And we're seeing, 360 around Raleigh, 360 around Charlotte, 360 around Greenville, 360 around Columbia, 45 minutes, an hour, hour-and-a-quarter away, places that are still very much small-town rural places that are building housing and attracting people. And so I think there's just a story out there of growth that I think is enabled by the fact that you can work some or all of your time remotely. Your spouse can work some or more of his time remotely. However that works out, I think that's a real opportunity for these places that have struggled to grow over the last decades.
That's neat. Yeah, I mean, again, it highlights just how different, even in one community, you can have a town that's growing and a town that's shrinking, and trying to figure out what the secret sauce is for that town that's growing is going to be really important. Let me come down the line this way, and again, start with Tom. So we're hearing lots of things you learned in your districts, but I know that when I travel around the country, and I'm sure when you travel around your districts, you often find kind of a lesson, an aha moment about something that you didn't understand as deeply until you see it in action on the ground, or a challenge that you don't understand as deeply until you experience it in your local community. So this may be a hard question, but when you have traveled around your district, what do you think the lessons are that you've taken away, some of the experiences that you've had that help you better understand the economic circumstances in rural America?
I mean, I'll just talk about what it feels like to sit in a small town with a bunch of small business owners and talk about the economy, because that's what we do every day. You know, at the FOMC, we worry that the labor market's kind of fragile. Job growth has been relatively slow. People aren't hiring. In the small towns that I'm in, people still can't find workers. It's a very tight job market, and that relates to the workforce challenges I talked about before. You know, we talk a lot about you know, some of the issues of the day. Tariffs would be a good example, and you're just struck by the degree of flexibility that bigger companies and bigger communities have to handle these issues versus, you know, what small business owners have. You can't go charter a plane during COVID and to get your stuff to, or, you know, or to go to China and get stuff in advance. You just can't do that stuff in a small town. So some of the stuff that's out there from a policy standpoint that affects the economy affects these small towns even more. There's a set of initiatives out there that look like they ought to have a ton of impact, but when you get to the ground, you find out, you know, what the challenges are. I'm reminded some of the Build Back Better, you know, era grants required matching funds, and we'd be in small towns. They're like, we don't have any matching funds. Like we don't have any. You know, but how do you get it? And so I just think the stuff that you think is happening on a national scale, when translated to a small town local, is just not as simple as it looks. That would be my net on it.
So I'm thinking about sitting in some of those same rooms, and I think also, though, for me, it's also really important just to see things. You know, so I think my image of what rural America looks like was kind of crystallized from like visiting my grandparents in western Minnesota. And so it's really interesting to me to be in the rural parts of Pennsylvania, you know, where the Amish and Mennonite communities are really a big part of the population, and to see pretty intense farming activities, right, that are much more concentrated than like, you know, a big huge field and every mile or so there's a farmhouse and then, you know, there's a church, you know. It's so I think it's a much more dense version of urban living that I had in my head. So that's been eye-opening and important for me, I think, to understand, like, well, wait, not everything is exactly the same, right? Like just to remind myself of that. I think the other thing that I've learned both from conversations with my team and then from being out there and talking to folks who are thinking about, like, well, how do we make this place a vibrant small town or rural area to raise our kids, to attract business, is that because of some of these issues that Tom's talking about, you really need homegrown conversations, right? So you need to hear from people, what is our capacity to absorb, you know, whether it's federal or state or philanthropic dollars, like at what pace? Often federal and state legislation and dollars come with like deadlines by when you have to spend things. And I think those deadlines can mean, you know, everybody's got to get the electricians on the same schedule. Well, that's going to be harder if you're in a rural community and there are fewer electricians to start with, right? Or it takes you longer to kind of get the project off the ground and get the pipeline going because you don't have that same infrastructure. So I think that, you know, one of the things that we try to do in our work is to listen and respond and to have community-led initiatives. And I think bringing people to the table and letting them drive and really inform this process is just absolutely critical in rural areas in particular.
Susan?
So, and you know, a lot of very similar themes, not surprisingly. You know, and I will reiterate, as my colleagues have, just how valuable and important it is to spend time listening, talking to people, hearing their experiences, their challenges. I mean, certainly, you know, I would say one of the things that was really inspiring for me was seeing the local connections solve problems, that when people came together and were focusing on the same problem, how much more effective that was. And, can talk more about some of those kinds of, because a lot of the challenges are real. So the extent to which there are programs that are designed, they're intended to help small business, but a lot of the entrepreneurs in rural areas and in other areas as well are really more micro businesses. And those programs weren't designed to help micro businesses, and the amount of paperwork and collaboration, if you have a part-time administrator, and again, you need those matching funds, it's almost a non-starter. And so, there are areas where some of these programs are just totally underutilized because they don't match what the needs and the challenges are. And people come up with very creative solutions for how to come together to try to figure out how to make things work. But that suggests that there are some collaborative solutions that could make things easier in that way. So those are some of the things. The infrastructure challenges, I would say, which we know about, but there's some that we might take for granted that you really can't, like the cell service one I had mentioned before. So that's kind of a big deal. So those are some of the things, and some of them. It's maybe the extent to which there's a disconnect, which is why actually going and talking to people and why empowering people locally. Sometimes just having one person who can dedicate full time to figuring out how to work on something is a significant kind of enabler for moving forward with a project. And that's a relatively small fix, but it's the kind of thing that can actually make a big difference.
We're going to come back to that in a little bit, because I think the convening role that you have all played in your districts is really super important. Let me hone in maybe on one or two challenges that you've talked about, and let's start with access to capital. Susan, you mentioned this quite extensively. How are communities in your district, rural communities in your district, dealing with what historically has been difficulty getting access to capital, whether that's for agricultural purposes or for home ownership, certainly for entrepreneurial activities and small business formation, or even kind of public infrastructure, which sometimes doesn't have enough access to capital from the public sector. So again, start with Susan and go down the line. How are you seeing your communities grapple with issues around access to capital?
Yeah, and the capital access issues are really formative because, that is really central to being able to address some of the challenges and to really foster vibrancy. So just to highlight, because I do want to give a couple of examples of things that have moved forward, but what they were able to address, I think, is maybe important to highlight. So some, and we actually brought a group together not too long ago, specifically a group of stakeholders from rural areas across New England, specifically to talk about access to capital and what they were seeing and what they were thinking. And the challenges they identified, there were really kind of two buckets. One was more kind of physical, things like infrastructure, not just broadband, but things like water and sewer constraints in terms of abilities to move things forward. But then a variety of other things that are more capacity and some of the things that we were talking about earlier. So one example was a group that came together in Vermont. There was a large project that they were trying to move forward. And by bringing together businesses, local civic leaders, community banks, and one of the other pluses that I meant to mention earlier is the just number of times that I have heard about the really strong connections between local and regional community banks in local communities as being very kind of central to providing access to capital and finance and helping to solve some of those challenges. But anyway, this group came together. They had to put together more than a dozen different funding sources to be able to pull together enough to create the capital stack to make this project work. And if you think about all of the pieces that it took to put that together, it gives a sense of kind of the coordination problem. But by bringing different leaders together from different sectors, they were able to solve that. And so a way to simplify what's needed in order to pull the resources together and jump through the requisite hoops. But I would say the solutions are very collaborative and people thinking together across sectors about identifying the problems and how to work through to solve them.
That's great. Anna?
So I'm gonna focus on community banks as well. I think they play a critical role, and in every one of those conversations where you're sitting around talking with people in rural areas, you can see that ecosystem, right? You can see the connection between, the community bank leader is somebody who lives in that community and wants that community to thrive, and also knows a lot of the people there. And so you see the real kind of relationship blending that can overcome some of the more formal barriers to getting access to credit. But I think what we've also seen is that, in surveys, folks in rural communities prefer banking in person, and they have stronger preferences to do that than in the urban areas, despite the fact that community banks are shutting. And so we're seeing more banking deserts. I mean, that's one of the things that we've been studying is the existence of banking deserts, where there's, you have to go a really, really long way to actually physically get to a branch. So individuals prefer to bank in person. Small businesses really prefer to bank in person, particularly in rural areas. And rural banks are sometimes under threat. And they're a critical part of this ecosystem that helps deploy capital. And part of that is, I think, because they do know the areas and their challenges so intimately. And so, I was in Bird in the Hand, Pennsylvania, where
Is that actually the name of the town?
it is actually the name of the town, and
That's
there's
great.
actually Bird in the Hand Bank, which is this fabulous bank, right, that has been, so it's a de novo bank since the financial crisis. I think it's the only one in Pennsylvania. And they serve the Amish community, right, the Amish and Mennonite community. So the Amish and Mennonite community realized that they needed to have a bank, and they wanted to have a bank that would respect the needs of their community, but also work with them. They have very successful farms, very successful businesses. They have all the banking needs of, any small business or any family. And they also self-insure, right? And so when you're like doing a home mortgage and somebody's like, oh yeah, my community's got that.
Right.
That's my insurance. Our banking regulations don't tee up with that. So there's a big effort that it takes to kind of overcome those challenges and allow them to make small business loans, to make home loans to this community that, makes this possible. And also to kind of respect people's preferences for, not driving and taking the mobile bank out to the place where people are so they can do their banking business at the same time they're gathering to sell products or to have some other kind of gathering. But all of those things, seem really straightforward somehow conceptually, but there's a lot of hoops to jump through to make that happen. So if you go to that, agricultural fair one year, it's like you've opened a branch. And if you don't want to go back the next year, you got to talk to the FDIC about closing that branch the same way you would if you were closing a physical branch. So there's, so you really have to be committed to the community in order to kind of make these solutions. It takes a lot of kind of commitment and kind of, working the problem from a lot of different sides. So I think that there's the ingenuity there, and then there's the kind of things that, may not seem like that big of a speed bump, but for some places and some communities can be a big speed bump. And so you need people who really understand, okay, how do we chip away at that? How do we make that barrier go away?
Tom?
So I think there are issues, access to capital, there are issues on the giving side and issues on the receiving side. We talked about banks on the giving side. If a bank's not in a community, then they're not going to be able to connect to the opportunities. I talked to a lot of philanthropies. They're actually dying to put more money into rural communities, but it's hard to get any scale. It's hard to find, by definition, they're small investments. It's easy, you can find a big investment in whatever, Detroit, and you get a lot of leverage, and you have to combine that with 100 small investments. It just doesn't, so there's just not a premise or a proposition. States or even the national government, people still want to give money to small towns, but it's the same thing. If you're trying to do a new water system, would you rather do it in Richmond, where the water system was out a year ago, or would you rather do it in some small town in Virginia? Because the cost is still going to be big and the population served is just not as productive. And so, the givers have issues finding premises that work in small towns. And as I was suggesting earlier, the receivers also have issues. Grant writing is a real skill. And, you know, the joke you hear in some states is that all of the grants that go into the community go to the universities, because the universities are really good at grant writing. You know, I talked about, you know, matching funds, but a lot of these government grants come with a lot of record keeping, accountability, and other reporting. That's a real challenge in a small town. And the person who comes up with the idea in the small town, almost by definition, it's the first thing they've done, right? And so you've got lots of entrepreneurs who are really excited about things, but they're just not yet ready to position it as well as they could to get access to the funding that's out there. So real challenges on the giving side, on the receiving side.
You know, just picking up on that theme, Tom, and you know, you mentioned this at the very end, capital alone is not enough. It's never enough. And you also need to make sure that the institution, the small business, the entrepreneur has the capacity, the skills capacity to use it effectively. And they also need access to business opportunities. If you're in a, you know, in an urban, densely populated urban area and you've got connections to local people, it may be easier for you to grow your business if you're in a rural community or you're in a distressed community in a rural community. It may be much harder to build that kind of network that's required to run a successful business. So let me just say, I have got maybe 2 or 3 more questions I'm going to ask our panel, and I haven't prepared them for this, but I'm thinking we might open it up to the audience because we've got really terrific experts around us on rural America. And so I'm going to maybe turn to you and see if you either have questions or you have things you want to make sure that we know about that is happening around the country. I don't mean like an advertisement for your work. I mean, you know, stuff on the ground in your communities that you think we should be aware of. So let me ask a question about artificial intelligence, again, that I haven't told them I'm going to ask them. There's a lot of growth in some rural areas in data centers. Have you, in your travels or in your discussions, talked to communities that are grappling with how to manage this data center investment? And I'm happy to take anybody who wants to start.
I was in Loudoun County, Virginia, which you could argue is a small town, or you could argue is a very upscale, you know, town. And I did a, you know, speech on the economy, and I asked for questions. And the first 3 were about pocket nuclear reactors. And I didn't understand it because I know nothing about pocket nuclear reactors. But it turns out that the #1 issue in Loudoun County was how are we going to avoid these things corrupting the feel of our community? And so they weren't as excited about the tax base. They've got a tax base, but they're really exercised about power wires and electrical, you know, displacement and all of those sorts of things. And that's what you hear. It's an investment that's not a big job creator other than the construction. And you know, the community leaders like it because there's a tax base that comes with it. But you know, I think a lot of the communities that I'm in, they don't quite get the value.
I don't know, Susan or Anna, if you want to add anything.
So I've heard varying things about this, right? I mean, this is particularly about data centers as an opportunity for community development, and you know, I think it varies a lot depending on, you know, whether you're an electricity, you know, exporting state, for example, or one that imports electricity. But one example is in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which I think is really interesting, where there was an existing empty warehouse that is going to be a data center, and it's the kind that I'm gonna totally butcher all of the terminology here, but it's the kind that has like a closed water system. So they're not using new water; they're recycling the water through to cool the plates and do all the things that they need to do. So this is not the most, you know, this isn't like one of the really, really, really huge data center farms. It's a relatively contained one, but they've negotiated a community benefits agreement with the community. They expect there to be, you know, 350 ongoing jobs, which is not insignificant there, and it's using existing, you know, space that was empty. When I talk to folks there, there's palpable excitement, and there's also, if we tried to do that deal today, it would never work, even with the community benefits agreement, because there's such a shift in people's attitudes about data centers, partly about, who knows what it is exactly, but they described it as being partly about like, look, I don't have any other way to express my feelings about or my fears about AI, therefore I want to push back on the data center because I know that's part of the ecosystem, right? Even if it might have benefits for my community. So a really interesting and nuanced conversation there. But that is, part of the rural development, story in big parts of Pennsylvania is trying to attract data centers. And there you run right into all these other issues that we've been talking about, like where do you get the electricians? And when you talk to big data center builders, they're like, we're going to go do that in Texas, right? Like we're going to go do that someplace where we can amass, the
Huge
energy,
scale.
the workers, they're going to look for the, the easiest place to do stuff. And so the costs are going to be a little higher, I think, in some rural areas. And then the public perception and the public support of these things that's a moving target.
So I would just say quickly, some similar conversations. Think about old mill towns that are in areas where there is real, potential with water, but real challenges as well. What seem like small amounts of employment can be notable in small communities, but at the same time, the number of different groups that need to be brought together to really explore how one might take advantage of such an opportunity in a way that actually was consistent with other concerns. So that can feel daunting, and so I've had conversations with groups that are interested in how do you explore that? How do you learn from what's going well, what isn't, and I would expect that would expand. But just very quickly, there's a lot of usage of AI in many rural areas that I hadn't necessarily expected. A lumber mill that you go for a tour and they're using AI to sort planks as a way, not because they were concerned, because they were trying to reduce their labor costs, but because they couldn't hire expertise. And so they felt pushed to figure out a way to meet the demand that they had that was still very strong. And it totally revolutionized how they thought about a lot of the other things and enabled them to employ different kinds of people that they might have better access to. So there are also really interesting examples of how AI is being used in rural industry that, so I always ask and I never know, and have heard some very interesting examples of that.
That's great. We've heard lots of what's going on in communities around the country, and Federal Reserve banks play an important role in engaging with their local community and providing research and convening. Maybe we'll do a last round starting with Susan before we open it up, and just you could provide some examples of the way that your Reserve Bank has been engaging with rural areas.
Sure, happy to do that. So we really think of kind of three interlocking sets of roles that we have in that space. One of them is related to research and data, and that is everything from understanding workforce barriers to understanding household, financial well-being, and to access to capital. And it actually came out of some research that our bank had done some time ago that the kind of foundations of what we call the Working Communities Challenge, or WCC, was really launched. So that research can be the basis for thinking through what kinds of activities might actually help to add vibrancy. So that's one bucket. A second bucket is really much more related to convenings, to listening, to better understanding. That's something we all do in a variety of different ways. It's kind of two-way communication. But by bringing people together, because so many of the ways to address challenges require people getting interconnected, and the Fed is actually well positioned to do a lot of that work in a variety of different ways. And then the third is more finding ways through programming, through outreach, to actually elevate the insights that you learn from those interactions. And the Working Places Challenge that I mentioned before, I think is a really example that we're still learning from and finding ways to expand. It ultimately had 30 sites across New England in 5 different states, and 14 of them were rural sites. It basically empowered with a little bit of funding that came from philanthropy and local government sources to support identifying a single focus area and then developing strategies with local leadership to find ways to address them. Things like workforce development, childcare challenges, access to housing. And again, 14 of those sites were in rural areas across New England. And really, again, came out of the research, engaged through local convenings, but was collaborative programming that we think we can still learn from, and we're always eager to learn from what others are doing as well, and to share the challenges, the opportunities, but hopefully identifying more of the ways to address them.
That's great. Thank you. Hannah?
So I'm going to echo a lot of those themes. I think, the research, the convening, the collaboration, are critical components of what we do as well. Often we work in partnership as well to do programming together, right? So that we, can expand our reach and then also, match expertise with the issues. So in Pennsylvania, or in Philadelphia, we're about a day's drive from anywhere in the district. And so one of the things that we do that Philip does a lot of is, puts a lot of miles on and is meeting with stakeholders individually, learning what the issues are, and then being very responsive about putting together webinars that exactly, match, here are the questions, here are the issues that are coming up in his conversations with rural community development leaders and other stakeholders. So, there's going to be one on data centers, very soon, partly because that's been coming up in those conversations. So those are very kind of like rapid response. You deal with the fact that, everybody's all over the place, but you can put, you've identified a need and you're meeting that need in a really direct way. And that's complemented by gatherings that we do where we bring rural leaders together so that people can network and learn from one another. We also do some more intensive work. And I would say the thing that pulls all of these things together is this idea of kind of like wanting to meet people where they are and help them tell us what they would like to do, and then using our convening power to help them get together with the expertise that they need, or with the pulling all the stakeholders in a community into the same place. And so that's the Reinventing Our Communities work, which has been a successful model in both urban and rural areas. But you're gathering together all the stakeholders, facilitating a conversation for them to identify the problem that they want to solve, what their priorities are, and then supporting them as they go through that process. And that's helped people to find these holistic solutions that match, healthcare and workforce, and say, oh, we can get more money if we approach these two things together and kind of kill two birds with one stone. But it's a way of building scale, which you heard from Tom is really critical in rural communities, and feeding off of the expertise that does exist. And so those have been really successful models.
Great.
Richmond Bank's working in four areas. The first is just presence. Our outreach team is very focused on making sure you're learning from urban and learning from rural. We even have in their metrics, making sure that they're spending enough time in small towns and not just in big cities. I personally have a plan. I'm 2 days every month in small towns in the district. This week I'm in Brevard, Tryon, Fletcher, and Hendersonville, North Carolina. And every month we're set up, and it's formal, it's structured, it's just part of what we do. So presence is a big part. I think it matters. The second thing we do is trying to lift up what works. Governor Barr was nice enough to mention our annual rural conference. I think this is now the 7th. It'll be in Asheville in October. Those of you who are here and might be interested in coming, Daniel Davis is right there and can get you an invitation. And we're very focused on making sure we expose communities to what other communities are doing that's working, because we don't have all the answers, and many of them do. When we go to a community and something interesting is going on, whether it be the transportation work that's being done in Wilson, North Carolina, or the childcare work that's being done in Abington, Virginia, or the entrepreneurship work that's being done in Grafton, West Virginia, or some of the apprenticeship programs in Yadkin County, North Carolina, we're trying to write about those, publish them, put them on the website, connect them to people so they see things that work and they can learn from each other and connect to each other. Third thing we do, like Susan and Anna said, is research. I talked about the communities that grow research a little while ago, but I'd also point you to some recent stuff we're doing in community colleges. We're a huge anchor institution in many small towns, highly valuable, massively mismeasured in terms of their impact. That has implications for funding. And we're doing a lot of work on the real impact of community colleges and what works and doesn't work, and how to invest more in those. And so research, that's the third thing. And then, the fourth thing, we were really excited about the Working Cities work that Susan and the Boston Fed have done. And we asked ourselves, can we take some version of that into rural markets and do a highly focused rural version of Working Cities called the Rural Investment Collaborative. And we're now in our third cohort, call it 60, 70 individual entrepreneurs in small towns throughout our district who have gone through framer training, and have gotten seed grants to help proposals for their work. And we're trying to do our best to introduce them to funders who can help fund it more broadly. So, we're actually trying to help facilitate the connection between funders and local entrepreneurs in a way that, like I said, very much builds off of the good work done by the Boston Fed. So all four of those things are places we're very excited about.
Thanks. I think we have a little bit of time for questions from the floor, and I may not be able to see all of you, so Angelique can help me call on folks.
And we have mics in back.
Thanks for convening this. David Lipsetz, Housing Assistance Council. What can you do as bank presidents right now with your CRA enforcement responsibilities to stop CRA from aggregating affordable capital in suburban and urban places to the detriment of rural places? The Fed was phenomenal in the 2023 negotiations for the rules, so maybe you can just say some of the things we had there. But if two bankers go into their credit committee and they ask for affordable capital from their bank for a housing development, the one next to a bank branch will get that loan every time. Nobody in a room full of community development folks who care deeply dislikes CRA for doing that, but clearly we need in rural places a way to get that affordable capital away from the bank branch to the communities that we serve.
So maybe I'll take that one on behalf of the Federal Reserve System. I think with respect to the 2023 rule, we made enormous progress in integrating the needs, the challenges, the experiences of rural America. And we understood, and the final rule reflected that we understood, that that capital is harder to get. And it requires more work on behalf of the bank. It sometimes can be more expensive to do. It certainly can be more complicated to do. And so the rule took that into account. Unfortunately, as you know, the banking sector, the trade groups for the banks, filed suit arguing that that rule was unlawful. And they won in the district court that they brought it in the Fifth Circuit. And we're now in a position where we needed to go back to the 1995 rule, just on the reality of the experience that we're in right now. But we still understand that we haven't forgotten that rural communities need more work and more help and more assistance. And so I do think there are ways for us within the existing framework to acknowledge that special kind of role. And I think it's an important area for us to work on.
Yeah, hi, Jim Barr from USDA Rural Development, and hopefully this is a little bit more of a softball question for you all. Maybe not.
That's good, then the presidents will take that one.
Yeah.
Let Governor Barr take the tough one.
We all have our jobs.
Yeah.
Right. So, as I'm sure you're aware, Treasury just released all the eligible census tracts for opportunity zones, so kind of opportunity zones 2.0. Curious to get your thoughts. Obviously, there's going to be, I think the list is over 8,000 census tracts that have been designated as rural opportunity zones, higher tax incentives. So I'd be curious to get any of your thoughts, because it didn't come up in our conversation. I have a lot that I took down, even though I belong to rural development, so thank you for that. But I didn't hear anything about opportunity zones, and I just want to give you an opportunity, excuse the pun, to discuss what opportunities as well as challenges might be to drive private investment through that tax incentive.
I should ask, I don't know, have any of you had experience in your communities with learning about opportunity zone projects?
More in the urban
Yeah.
landscape than in the rural. I haven't heard that. I mean, it's a good call out, and I'll ask some questions about it. But
Yeah.
you know, the challenge I always had with them in the urban context was that when you've got 8,000 investment opportunities, the single best investment opportunity is the one sort of right next to the stadium. You know, it's just the economics that are so much better than the one that's in the least good part of town with no adjoining benefit. And so I'll be curious. I'll be curious
Yeah.
what the any tax incentive is a good incentive if you want to get development going, but whether it tracks incremental capital, I'll just be interested in seeing what the dynamics are.
I think we have time for one more.
Chris Estes, North Carolina Rural Center. Thank you again for the convening. I want to laud you all for the work that you were describing of convening, listening, reflecting, and make one suggestion that what has happened in recent years is that we have done a lot more of connecting and understanding rural, but that conversation has been sort of separate from the conversations that people are having about urban. And so as folks who have big regional districts and frankly a different kind of pulpit to talk about the value of rural, to bring that to your non-rural audiences. The two words I think I use the most are interdependence and interconnectedness. Because to talk about what's different about rural, what's working in rural, why that shifts the more traditional economic development folks who are generally not with the folks in this room on strategy. The business communities, the folks who think about the value tend to look at discussions about rural as, well, you're doing something that's going to create less value than if you did it with us. And there's this implied sense of competition from a scarcity framework. And you all are some of the few institutions that could have those conversations with audiences who are, you know, whereas we're generally talking to our own rural brethren, so to speak, and when we're talking to our statewide chambers or other folks, that's sort of a nice thing, but there's a little pat on the head with that sometimes. Whereas when the Fed's talking about it, it has a different resonance of the value for the whole state, why should Philadelphia care? Why should Richmond or Charlotte care? Why should Boston care? So my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
a wonderful suggestion. Susan, do you want to just follow
So
up?
thank you for the comment. Let me just say a couple of things about that. One is that, it's hard to pick the many examples, but 2 of the examples that I picked were actually trying to help make those connections. So the one about the cancer genome, that was connecting the Jackson Labs, which is in Bar Harbor, and it's connecting cancer experts, most of whom are in urban centers, with rural communities. And so that connection is one of the things related to the healthcare that is really central. And then some of the work related to some of the engineering entrepreneurship, and that then becomes about transportation and the connectivity and how to make sure that you bring people together so that you can see win-win situations. The one other thing I'll say is that the initiative that I talked about that Tom mentioned started out as working cities. That's where it started focusing on small cities and what we knew about resurgence of small cities. But then we actually did expand it out. So the name, it has like 3 or 4 different names. It was working cities and then working places and then working communities. But ultimately 14 of the 30 were rural, and that means an opportunity to bring all of the networks across all of those sites, some of which were more urban-based, some of which were rural, together to talk about common challenges. So there were multiple groups that looked at housing issues, that looked at empowering youth that looked, and so that's actually a cross-fertilization for some of those groups that are trying to be problem solvers. But I do think there's more work to do in that space, and appreciate the comment.
Yeah, I think that's a really useful comment to think about the broader ecosystem and the connections across places and how, what lifts all boats kinds of things, right? And also just, obviously products that are created in rural areas are sold other places, but there's workforce connections as well, right? So I've heard from, rural manufacturers who are trying to find skilled laborers who go and recruit at urban high schools, right? And they're taking buses out to, come and see what this new cool factory floor looks like because, this is, where you could come and live and make a really good living. And then I think on the other side, our rural areas tend to be on the leading edge of some of the demographic changes that we're going to be experiencing more broadly as a country. And so thinking about what we can learn from rural areas as we address, an aging workforce or an aging economy generally, I think there's just a lot of cross-fertilization. And I hear what you're saying too about the funding part, but thinking about how you link those things together seems really powerful.
Well, I wish we could talk for another hour, but you all have real work to do when we step away. Would you please join me in thanking our wonderful panel? Thank you all very much.
So thank you. We're going to take a short break. We'll come back at around 2:20 or so. Feel free to network and look forward to more interaction and questions. Thank you.